She screamed. It was a horribly wrenching sound to the two figures clad in black. How long would she keep this up? One had the notion of stopping their momentum, going to her head and knocking her out with one of the scattered rocks on the burnt soil. The other, seeing the look in their companion's eyes, shook her head. This was not how things were done. "Bastards!" the victim howled, clawing her nails deep into the ground. Did she really think that was going to stop them? "You're all fucking bastards! When Father hears about this..." The two figures laughed, dropping her legs to the floor. "Your father?" The man grabbed at his stomach, doubling over. "Her father! Did you fucking hear that? Her father's gonna do something to us." "Oh!" Vanda feigned a shiver. "Bosco, not her father! Whatever shall we do?" They laughed at her expense, soon grabbing her legs, digging dirty nails into her soft flesh. She screamed. They howled. Your father's dead, you daft bitch!" Bosco dragged her along a bit harder than Vanda, his companion stumbling over her feet. "We made sure of that. I cut his ears off. Vanda over here pulled out his teeth. After I shattered them with a hammer." "Very dedicated to her craft, my little Vanda," Bosco chimed in. Then, and this was genius, "we hoisted him up and shoved a flagpole right up his ass." The helpless woman twisted and cried manically, which only made her captors giddy. They came upon a building that seemed to be a grocer at one point in time. Rusted signs and peeling wood surrounded all four corners of the place, shattered windows littering the dead soil with shards of glass. The doors, or more specifically, the place where the doors should have been, were caving in, making it almost impossible to slip in. Slam! Something behind the shop made a noise so abruptly that it made the kidnappers jump in the air. It wasn't long before another, sharper slap filled their ears. It sounded like someone, or more importantly, something, was scrounging around in the abandoned shop. "Stay here," Bosco grumbled towards his companion. She began to retaliate. "Fucking stay here!" That was the end of that argument. Though Vanda stood there with one hand on hips scowling at him, Bosco headed towards the crumbling door, slipping into the cracks and disappearing into the shadows. It was pitch black inside the store, the light from outside barely making it through the crumbled entryway. Bosco rummaged around in his trouser pockets, fumbling with his last match. Fire crackled as he struck the tip of the match against the nearby wall, bringing at least a bit of light to his eyes. This place had seen better days for sure. The outside not the only thing about the store that was a mess. Shelves were tipped over, its contents spilled and long since dried up, leaving pools of various colored stains into the rotting wood. Dust hung about the place like a thick scarf, almost suffocating you. More than once, Bosco found himself coughing, trying his best to cover his mouth from the dust around him. Fuck! A voice called out in the back of the store. It sounded helpless, sheepish even. Come on! Bosco brought the match to his lips, blowing out the flame in a single huff. He had gotten a good enough look around to make his way towards whoever was speaking. The robe had to go. Didn't need the shuffling of fabric to alert his presence. He didn't bother folding it, just casually throwing the thing over his shoulders. Never liked the damn thing anyway, especially in this heat. Bosco began to move through the store, his steps surprisingly light for a man his size. "Don't go too fast," he kept telling himself, feeling around with his hands. Last thing he needed was to trip over a bottle or bump into one of the fallen shelves. Vanda, meanwhile, was perched on a rock, feet tapping the brown soil beneath her. She hadn't had the desire to hold on to the scrawny bitch beneath her, so she went about using the last of her rope to tie the thing's legs together. To add insult to injury, Vanda had also gone and tore off a piece of her robe's sleeve, using it as a gag. Finally! Though she still groaned and whimpered around the gag, it was a much-needed improvement over the captive's wails. "You know what we're gonna do with you, right?" Vanda snarled, hopping off the rock to sit cross-legged before her catch. "Do you even know who we are?" The bound woman shook her head, Vanda clapping along. "What a dumb cunt! Is this how they raise you in those big old mansions? Completely oblivious to the world around you?" Vanda leaned back, kicking the woman in the chest repeatedly. "Your daddy never told you a damn thing? Not a one?" The captive shook her head once again, tears welling up in her eyes. "Wow! And to think if he had told you something, you could have been able to get..." Wood cracked and exploded outward from the decaying building behind her. Vanda jumped up into the air as fast as she could, knife at the ready. "Daddy?" There was someone else who had landed onto the ground before the store, though he was too tall to be Bosco. He moved about, lifting his head from the caked dirt with blood running from his nose and a newly busted lip. His eyes met Vanda's, and he began raising his hand for help before a loud roar came from behind him. Bosco had ripped through the rest of the wood, blocking his path, flinging pieces into the air as he stumbled towards the downed man. Vanda could see that several shards of glass had been embedded into Bosco's back, though the stout man seemed not to be bothered by it. He kept screaming like some caveman as he scooped his much taller opponent into the air, sending him crashing down onto his back feet away. The man did his best to stumble back onto his feet, but Bosco wouldn't allow it. He reached behind and pulled one of the glass bits from his back, thrusting it into the man's chest, his victim falling flat to the ground almost instantly. Bosco stood over him, panting and heaving his shoulders for any breath he could get. Though Vanda tried to say something to him, Bosco held up a hand, moving it into his pocket once again to pull out some rope of his own. He went about wrapping up the man before him, who was still breathing despite his injuries. Gotta show you something. He didn't wait to see if she'd follow, heading back into the store. Vanda wasn't about to disobey now, stealing one last glance at the man at her feet before running inside to catch up with her father. "Fucker attacked me!" Bosco growled, lighting another match to help walk Vanda through the disheveled place. He had left it in a worse condition now with the scuffle he had just had. "Broke a damned mirror and, well, you can see what happened after that." Was he going to pull those shards out of himself? Vanda didn't bother asking, knowing he'd take care of it when he felt like it. "What was he doing here, father?" she asked instead, keeping close to him the entire time. It wasn't long before her feet stepped into something wet. Her eyes traveled down to a pool of what looked like greenish liquid, and quite a bit of it, too. It seemed to lead to somewhere behind the counter, the rest of the fluid flung against the wall in spackles. "He was protecting this!" Bosco pushed the counter aside with little to no effort, revealing to his daughter what had caused all of this mess. It was tall, taller than any man, and its skin was made of white burlap. Sable, Episode 7, Congregation of None. The town of Barnaby had been forever changed since that fateful day. The family governing over the hamlet were the cream of the crop when it came to humans that showed compassion, empathy, and love to all they passed during their day-to-day activities. More than once, the thought of making the father their mayor for life had come up, and he would always cast such notions away with a loving smile and a shrug. His wife was a blessing to the school and church, helping out any way she could, and the children were raised to respect such values, doing their part as well, every single day. Their deaths were unexpected, especially when considering just how they had died. Reports went that the entire family had walked out into town square, staring off into the distance with a permanent smile on their face. When offered help, the father had killed the sheriff in town, ripping his arms off and watching as the poor sod bled to death in front of him. No one ran in to save the sheriff, screaming and dashing towards their own homes, locking themselves in tight. Watchers then spoke of the family turning towards one another, hugging one last time before they began slaughtering each other, seeming to quite literally rip pieces of themselves off with brute strength. It wasn't long before they were silent, and the streets ran thick with their blood. Now, this little village in London was no longer the serene, tranquil vacation spot of dreams. It was hell itself. What happened after has been up for debate ever since then, none of the theories ever getting it quite right. The people of Barnaby had never left, but they also hadn't given a try to returning their lives to normal. The truth was, they hadn't been given a choice in the matter, for not a day later, they had all met their ends as well. A group, no, an army of men and women had walked into the streets of Barnaby in mere hours, their leader a figure clad in black robes that hid all of their features. The residents of Barnaby walked out onto the streets to meet this invading force, but not willingly. Something was urging them to move their feet. Something was forcing their bodies to move without their approval. Soon, the town square was filled with souls, every single resident of the town standing before the figure and its army. They knelt down, though most screamed as they did so, and they lowered their heads to the ground. Bodies shook, but they couldn't move beyond that. "The old must die," was the figure's words, every last bit sounding like sweet venom dripping from teeth. "Know that your end will be the stepping stones for a new empire. My empire." The army moved past their leader, brandishing long, hooked blades. "Those that come after you will praise your sacrifice, so please." The first row of villagers were sliced with blades, heads taken clean off. Still, none could move as their bodies rattled with fright. "Stay calm. Don't fight it." The second row was gone, a mother blubbering as she watched her children's lives escape before her eyes. "The congregation will remember you as heroes, not cowards." The mother was soon silenced, her head tossed to the ground. "Statues will be raised in your honor. Songs will be made for this very day. You will be legends." It wasn't long before there were no more screams, no gasps. There was just silence. This figure standing over the dead, arms crossed over its chest. That had been over 100 years ago. Since then, the congregation had turned Barnaby and the surrounding area into a hellish landscape. The air was always filled with a putrid stench, and the grass around them had turned a deep, dark brown. Food that they needed? It was stolen. Materials? Also stolen, and in large quantities. No one dared to stop these demons, lest they wanted what happened to Barnaby to happen to them. It was here that the rumors began, that the once lovely town was now cursed, a home for demons. Stories told of a giant of a man, clad in black, who was Satan in human form. His throne was said to be smack dab in the middle of town square, right where the family had killed themselves. The so-called giant had returned a couple days ago, ready to sit on his throne of death and decay. "You can't be serious!" Kelvin slammed his fist on the table as the words poured from him. "Tell me you're jesting, brother!" Bosco shook his head, lowering it as he met his brother's gaze. I wish I was, brother," he responded slowly, hands wringing together. He hated the meeting room, especially when he was there. But I saw it for myself, with my own eyes. "And at no point did you think it would be wise to bring the damn thing back?" Kelvin rose from his seat, clearing the distance between him and his much smaller, much chubbier sibling. "For all we know, it's still alive! You said the man was guarding it. Could he have been nursing it back to health?" Bosco just moved his lips inaudibly before his brother grabbed him by the shoulders, hiking him up. "Say something, you damned fool!" "Enough!" There was a third in this meeting, and he was, perhaps, more frightening than Kelvin. He was dressed in a black robe that seemed to bellow out like smoke. Its hood was pulled back, revealing a bald man that seemed as old as the earth. His eyes were small, squinted, and all over his face were black markings made from ink. "Kelvin, your brother isn't lying, so put him down this instant." He watched with cold gray eyes as the bigger man did as he was told, Bosco brushing himself off. "And you, allow me to be the first to say that I am proud of you. You did a remarkable task this day, you and your lovely daughter." Many thanks, Lord." Bosco lowered his head in reverence, not even bothering to look at the shocked expression of his brother. "And I'm sure Vanda will appreciate such kind words. I'll go tell her right now." The man shook his head, grinning from ear to ear. No, you will not. We still have some issues to discuss. While Kelvin was wrong to lay hands on you, he does bring up a good point. How do you know that the glutton is dead? How can we be sure it won't be up and running in a few days, maybe even less? He leaned towards Bosco, never leaving the seat. "We could have a real, serious threat here, my faithful servant. What are you going to do about it?" His words were like honey, soothing and sweet. I'll go out there tonight, right now even." Bosco saw the man's nod. "Don't worry, my lord. It'll be dead on this very table before the sun rises tomorrow. That I can promise." The lord smirked. "Well, how can I say no to something so reassuring? All right, go. Right now, Bosco. And don't come back until you're dragging it by its damned feet." Bosco did nothing but nod, turning on his heels to dash out of the room, leaving the withered man and Kelvin alone. "Don't bother arguing with me, Kelvin," the man wheezed, leaning back against the chair, closing his eyes. "If his story is true, that thing won't be able to move for another week or so." There was a troubling silence. "If you have something to say, spit it out, right now." Kelvin stalled for a moment, rocking back on his feet. "Well, He looked about before taking a few steps closer to the man on the throne. Do you really think we're ready for this? I mean, this is a declaration of war. What if we can't get the weapons together? What happens if there's fear spread throughout the ranks? He dropped his tone to a dull whisper. You expended so much of yourself at Elder House. You practically drained yourself bringing us back here. The man began to protest. Kelvin wouldn't allow it. They can't see it, but I can. You're weak, as weak as you've ever been. When do we say enough is enough for you? Never. The man coughed, shaking his head. Never, Kelvin. I won't give up until I'm dead by their hands and not a second before. Let them bring their mightiest, and I'll tear them down with my bare hands. He sighed. Monsters like them need to be put down. They've been running rabbit for way too long, so let them come. Let them see that they can die, that they can and will lose the war. I'll be happy to show them. There was a brief moment of silence as he lowered his head. Is dinner ready? Kelvin bit his lip before nodding, heading towards the door. Yes, my lord, she is. What stepped into the room was the woman that Bosco and Vanda had dragged here. She was bloodied, and a lump was forming on her head. She couldn't even bring herself to look up at the cloaked man, keeping her eyes planted on her own 2 feet. Kelvin shut the door behind her, keeping a close pace with her, pulling a butcher's blade from the back of his trousers. Before this happens, let me tell you personally that I'm sorry. The man stood from his seat, Kelvin coming over to quickly undo his cloak, letting it drop to the ground. There are less and less of you out there, and I must survive if I'm going to see the kingdom of paradise unleashed on this land. His body was racked with wounds long since infected. Bubbling boils of pus riddled his body from head to toe. It seemed like every step he took brought pain, the man seeming to wince as he got closer and closer to his dinner. She was so distracted by his visage that she had just now noticed that he was missing both of his hands. The stumps at the end of his arms had long since been singed, the skin around the area as black as tar. Kelvin gripped the woman's hair with one hand, pulling her down towards the table, slamming her head against the wood. She was a shaking, whimpering mess, hands outstretched for help that wouldn't arrive. The giant of a man took the opportunity, swinging his blade high in the air, only to bring them down at her wrists, clearly removing those desperate hands. The room was filled with blood-curdling screams before the woman passed out from shock, landing on her back. Make sure it's quick, the man whispered to Kelvin, leaning his head down towards her hands. It's not her fault it had to be this way. Kelvin nodded, turning away just in time to miss the sight of his lord beginning to eat away at the hands before him. Sickly body pressed against the wood as he ripped flesh and muscle away with just his teeth. Kelvin dipped low, grabbing the fainted woman and carrying her away from the room, leaving the man to his meal. It was many minutes before he was finished, leaving nothing but a hint of bone on the table. Now, I think it's about time I paid our new prisoner a visit. His name was Cassidy. This wasn't his home. He'd get out of here. He'd get home. The man in the cell whispered those 4 thoughts over and over to himself as he stared at the door leading into the makeshift prison. How long had he been down here? There were no windows. The few that seemed to be in this room blocked by bricks long ago. Time seemed to be such a fuzzy memory that he couldn't quite tell when he had first arrived. Surely it had to have only been a few hours. That's why no one had come to his aid yet. My name is Cassidy. This isn't my home. I'll get out of here. I'll get home. Screeching filled the air of his chamber as the door opened, a frail man in a flowing cloak stepping in from the darkness. They stared at each other for a moment, someone grabbing the door from behind the man and locking it. Do you know who I am? The man started, taking a seat on a nearby chair. Yes, was Cassidy's only response, keeping his eyes glued on his captor. And yet, you don't fear me. Should I? Cassidy allowed himself a smile. You look like the wind would knock you over. I'm sure a punch from me would break every last bone in your body. He shrugged. So I guess to answer your question, no. I don't fear you, nor will the others when they find me. So there are others. The man leaned forward on his chair, piercing Cassidy's very being with his gray eyes. Don't play games with me. You already know that. There are others, lots of them, and when they find me, they're going to wipe this place off the map. There's going to be nothing left of you or any of your slaves. The man closed his eyes, taking a breath. That isn't the way to speak to a god, you know. Show me a god and I'll happily learn my manners. Cassidy felt his left hand shaking as it moved towards the right. He wasn't doing this. The shaking didn't stop as his hand wrapped around 2 of the fingers on his right, bending them back until bone protruded from his newly made wound. He couldn't even scream, the shock hitting him hard. The man stood up, kicking the chair behind him. You're already testing my patience, dog, he snapped, pressing himself against the cell door. I want numbers. I want locations. Do they even know you're here? What about your glutton? Bet you weren't expecting to lose it, were you? He forced Cassidy to bend his fingers back further. I can make it stop, you know. Now a 3rd finger was broken. Or I can keep it up. Your choice. Did it really matter? Cassidy growled under his breath, the pain forming sweat on his brow. His left hand would not release his broken fingers, threatening to break another. Okay. His left hand removed itself from his ruined right, placing itself back onto the bench he was sitting upon. I'll talk. We know you've been snooping around, getting into places you shouldn't be. You mean your little fortresses? The man asked, sweat beginning to form on his face as well. He shouldn't have done that. Too much needed energy now wasted on this pathetic thing before him. Found an awful lot of them so far. Just got a map that leads to the rest. He licked his lips, his heart thumping in his chest. Like the one right beneath our feet. Cassidy looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks. They're gonna try and stop you before you find the last 2. That's why I'm here, he cursed. I was a fucking scout. I was sent here to find your base, to witness how big of an army you're packing. Now I'm wondering if I wasn't sent here as a scapegoat. He bit his lip. Why are you doing this? You know what happens if you find the last 2? Your lies have lasted long enough, the man replied bitterly, leaning down to look Cassidy in the face. Your kind are monsters, ones I can never forgive. And you're any better? Cassidy spat at his face. We've been keeping an eye on you, torturing people, making them do your bidding, acting like a god. And you did nothing, the man screamed. If I was such a threat to humanity, if I was such an evil, why is it now that you're deciding to come after me? He waited for no response. It's because I now have a way of hurting you, of ending all that you've caused, and that frightens you and your ilk. You aren't worried about the innocent. You're worried about being shown that you are not immortal, that you are not above judgment. You've played God long enough. Now it's time to show the men behind the curtain. He stood up straight once again, turning his back on Cassidy. He wouldn't kill the pathetic creature. Not just yet. He wanted Cassidy to watch as everything he knew was taken from him. That would be a fate worse than death. You all are meaningless, Cassidy whispered, causing the man to turn towards him. You're all just a speck. A tiny little dust particle in the grand tapestry of the universe. Everything you do here is unimportant on a purely galactic level. There are worlds, different versions of this one, that are far and beyond what you all have managed to do. It's almost funny. There are worlds that have created bombs that can wipe out entire countries. We have worlds where sickness is a thing of the past. Hell, we even have worlds that do the whole evil shtick a hell of a lot better than you people. He pointed his good hand at the so-called god. You think you're the only one who seemed to figure out the whole damn thing, and you're not even the 1,000th. We've dealt with people smarter than you, stronger than you, better looking than you, he scoffed. And in the end, the same thing happens. Either we get rid of you and the world keeps spinning, or we just wipe out the whole damn thing. Just another world lost in the sea of them. He could see the hesitation in the man's face as he turned to look towards Cassidy. Did you really fucking think that we'd allow you to what? Shape the world to your liking? That we'd allow someone like you to run the fucking show? Don't make me laugh. All you're doing is making the thought of wiping you all out that more appealing. That's it. The pain was unbelievable, but Cassidy still smiled wide. Still want to try and find what you're looking for? You'll only be signing your death warrant. He had heard enough. Cassidy was soon impaling himself on his own broken bones, puncturing holes into his throat. The caged man screamed before the sound became gurgling slurps, blood rushing down his paling face. He didn't want to admit it, but the Lord knew he watched Cassidy die with a smile on his face. None of what he said could have been true. He was just bluffing. He had to have been. He would bring about paradise, even if it meant war. Kelvin soon opened the door, not even willing to acknowledge the corpse in the cell. "Master, some scouts say that they've spotted a carriage drawing closer." The Lord smiled grimly, pushing his doubts back. "I do believe our locksmith is here." Sable was written and narrated by me, Lane Lloyd. If you'd like to follow the show or just follow my antics, you can always find me on Twitter at @the_Lane Lloyd. That's LANELLOYD. Sable's theme song, Unfamiliar Places, was written and performed by Alex Lankford and Trevor Eyelers, and you can find a link to the song in the show notes below. Guys, we have iTunes, we have Stitcher, we have Google Play, hell, we even have a website, even though I'm still actually kind of working on that website, but still, we have a website. So, it would be in your best interest, and in mine, if you liked, commented, and shared all of these episodes with a friend, with someone you hate, your uncle that you see all the time at Thanksgiving. Just force earphones onto somebody and say, listen to this, I promise it won't make you crazy like last time. I think that's it for this week. This was a very fun episode to record, actually. I like yelling, and I like having characters who yell. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it, and I hope you stick around, because we only have, 3 episodes until Season 1 ends? So I'm excited. You should be excited. The person you're forcing to listen to this should be super excited. Anyway, I'm rambling again. This is Lane. This has been Sable, and have a good week.